Hi there. Hopefully I don't have to preface this video with another little clip talking about how it was out of focus. Hopefully I have now set my camera properly, and hopefully my big fat head is now in perfect focus. Well, what are we going to talk about today? I've actually been sitting in this seat for a while because I just got about 2/3 of the way through a video that was rambling around and really didn't make a point. And at that point in the video, I started to realize that what I really wanted to talk about, and that is the misconceptions still that people have about sensor size. Now, first of all, let's get one thing out of the way. This idea of multiplying your aperture by your crop factor only applies to depth of field. It has nothing to do with exposure. So a 2.8 is a 2.8 regardless of what format camera it's on. The difference is not, though, because of the size of the sensor. It's because of the focal length of the lens. If I'm going to use my Micro Four Thirds camera with a standard focal length, i.e. a 50mm equivalent, it's going to be a 25mm lens. A 25mm lens has far more depth of field than a 50mm. The result is that if I am using let's say a 1.4 25mm, then it's going to have the equivalent field of view and depth of field of a 50mm f2.8. However, if you set both of them at f1.4 and that is the correct exposure, they will both give you the correct exposure. The fact is that multiplier has nothing to do with exposure. It has only to do with depth of field, and only because of the different focal length that's being used, not because of the size of the sensor. Okay, let's get another one out of the way. Smaller sensor, more noise. Yes. Okay, done. Move on. Now let's talk about the real advantages and the real point of lenses. First of all, this lens right here, this is an older kit lens. This is the kit lens that came out on the original EM5. It is a 12 to 50. That would make it equivalent to a 24 to 100mm. It's quite a slow lens. It's a 3.5 to 6.3, so it's not a fast lens. It has some neat features such as a power zoom, a very nice macro mode that gives you about a 2 to 1 macro. It has a function button on the side here that will lock focus in its default setting, so that instead of using a back button focus, I can focus here, lock it here. As long as I keep my finger on that button, the focus is locked. I can take my picture, I can keep it there, it'll stay locked. As soon as I release it, when I touch again, it'll refocus. Nice feature. Anyhow, notice how tiny this is. I mean, this has a hood on it, and it's this small. If you look at something like a 24 to 105 f4 lens, granted, that's an f4 lens, it's going to be faster. For a full frame, it's much, much larger for two reasons. Number one, the longer focal length lenses, the longer the focal length is, the larger lens design is likely to be. I know that's not always the case. You look at some wide-angle lenses and they're quite large compared to much longer focal lengths. So that's a small part of it. A much bigger part is that the lens has to project an image. Lenses project a round image into the camera. That round image has to be large enough to cover the sensor. That's why if you were to take a 25mm lens for Micro Four Thirds and somehow manage to put it on a full frame body, you would notice extreme vignetting, because the image circle projected by the lens is only designed to fit a Micro Four Thirds or a 4/3 sensor. A 4/3 sensor is considerably smaller. That same circle is not going to cover the full size of a 35 millimeter film frame, which is the size of a full frame sensor. As a result, you get the vignette. At the same time, if you take your 50 millimeter lens from your full frame camera and put it on the crop sensor camera, whether it's APS-C or micro 4/3, you will find that there is no issue. There is, even if the lens vignetted slightly on the full frame, it probably doesn't vignette at all on the crop sensor body, simply because it's now projecting a circle far larger than is required for that sensor. That far larger circle means that you're only really reading what's coming in at the center of the lens. Okay, so that's how image circle works. And that's why lenses designed for full frame have to be larger. They have to project that much larger image circle. The result is that for lenses of equivalent field of view, now you have to be careful again with that. Remember, are the lenses actually equivalent? No. A 25 millimeter lens is a 25 millimeter lens. It is not a 50 millimeter lens. It will give you the field of view that a 50 millimeter will if it were on a full frame camera. And that's where people get confused. They seem to think that somehow this is a 50 millimeter lens now, it just says 25 on it. No, it acts like a 25. It's just that the field of view has been cropped, and that's why they're called crop sensor cameras. It has been cropped down to a smaller area and therefore magnified. All right, so therein lies the big advantage of micro 4/3, smaller lenses. You take even large lenses that would be considered wildlife lenses, like a 100 to 400 Lumix lens. The 100 to 400 Leica Lumix zoom is quite small. It is actually probably smaller than your typical 70 to 200 f2.8. It's probably almost as small as a 70 to 200 f4. Because of the fact that, again, it has to project to a much smaller image circle. Now remember, that 100 to 400 means that the equivalent field of view, what you're actually taking a picture of, is going to appear the same as it would with a 200 to 800 millimeter full frame lens. Now imagine that lens for a moment. Okay? A 200 to 800 millimeter with a reasonable aperture, let's say a 4 to 5.6. It's going to be humongous. It's going to be a large lens because it has to project a larger image circle and it's a much longer focal length. So guys, I heard a very bad explanation once. Somebody was talking about pixels on subject. And they were saying that cropping a full frame sensor gave you more pixels on subject than using a crop sensor of the same resolution, which of course is totally wrong. If you were to take a crop from let's say a 42 megapixel camera, you are going to end up with the equivalent of about, if you're going to crop it to APS-C size, you're going to have the equivalent of about 18 megapixels. Whereas the person next to you with a 24 megapixel crop sensor camera and the same lens, they have 24 megapixels on that same field of view that you had by cropping. So in actual fact, smaller sensors can put more pixels on subject. They just may require a little more light in order to produce clean images. Okay, now I have wandered too far away from my original premise. And my original premise, the only takeaway you need from this is the fact that the larger image circle required for a full frame camera means that it's going to have significantly larger lenses than an equivalent field of view lens for a crop sensor camera, whether it's APS-C or micro four thirds. And don't multiply the aperture by the crop factor to talk about exposure. It has nothing to do with exposure. Only use that particular calculation to talk about depth of field, equivalent depth of field. And I think people are starting to get a little bit away with this fascination with bokeh, and starting to look at images for their impact rather than for what you can manage to get out of focus. So maybe that is something to consider. Do you really want all of your images to just be mush in the background and a sharp subject, or do you want to occasionally put the subject in context? It's an interesting twist. In low light, something like an f1.2 lens, let's say the, what shall we put, the 25 millimeter f1.2 on a micro four thirds, and a 50 millimeter f1.2 on a full frame Canon. And let's go out and shoot in the same light. What you might find is that the limited depth of field of the f1.250 might make it difficult, very difficult, to get everything that you want in focus in that low light. You may have to stop down, which means you may have to jack up your ISO. Whereas the micro four thirds camera, with its greater depth of field due to its only being a 25 millimeter lens, might actually get everything you need in focus at f1.2, which means that you do not have to jack up the ISO, so there will be less noise. The overall result is that the actual difference in noise may not be as great as you would think. Yes, the full frame camera's sensor is going to be cleaner. But guys, look back at images from the greatest photographers, and you will find that lots of them show lots of grain, lots of them show things that aren't always sharp. I think our fascination with the technology, our fascination with sharpness and lack of noise may be pushed to the point where we are forgetting about the fact that most people are just going to look at the image and they are going to judge it by its impact, not by how many stops of noise reduction had to be applied. Anyhow, enough of this. I'm sorry to have wasted so much of your time. If you like this video, unlikely as that may be, give it a like. If you want to see more of my videos, and this one hasn't totally spoiled you from that, then by all means subscribe to my channel. And if you think anybody needs this long-winded explanation of why it's all right to have micro four thirds, then of course share it. Well folks, bye for now.